Now, at the height of the Cold War, a KGB officer, overwhelmed by his double life, turned himself in at a London police station. But was his new collaboration genuine, or was he still working for the Kremlin while claiming to be a disgruntled KGB officer? A tale of paranoia and subterfuge. Oleg Lyalin's cooperation with the MI5 led to the expulsion of more than 100 spies from Britain, and the full details can now be revealed for the first time in a new book called The Defector. And the author of this extraordinary book, Richard Kerbaj, joins me now. Richard, hello.
Thank you for having me. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks very much for being with us. What drew you to the story? Oleg Lyalin, am I saying that right?
Lialin.
Lialin.
Yeah,
I'm never saying it right,
a variation.
am I? Yeah.
It's good. What drew me to the story? So while I was researching my first book, The Secret History of the Five Eyes, I was sort of delved into the 60s and early 70s, and I noticed that this story had a massive impact on Britain's national security and also Britain's thinking about its relationship with the US. And so I thought this probably requires further research. So I spent a few years doing exactly that. And one of the themes that emerges, and I'll go into the characters in a bit, but one of the main themes that emerged is how Britain was not always aligned with the US during the Cold War. And this is a really great case in point. This is a point where MI5 realized that for its own benefit and in the interest of national security, it needs to put aside the special relationship for a little while and just focus on its own analysis. And as a result of doing that, it generated this huge triumph that led to the defection of this guy, Oleg Lialin, and the expulsion of 105 Soviet spies.
And that expulsion, mass expulsion of Soviet so-called diplomats in 1971, it was the largest of its kind.
Yes.
How pivotal was that in the sort of the Cold War?
Huge, because leading up to that moment during the 1960s, MI5 had been warning about KGB activity in the UK, but there was no political will to really do much about it. And also MI5, in fairness to the politics of the day, had no idea what the scale of the threat was. They overestimated it by some accounts, but they also underestimated it in other accounts. But what Oleg Lialin was able to do when he presented himself to MI5 in early 1971 was give him a sense of exactly what the plots were that were sort of unfolding. And he mentioned plots against politicians, to assassinate politicians, plots against Britain's seawater to contaminate it with radioactive waste. He exposed the identities of KGB officers operating in the UK. So as a result of having all of that information, MI5 was able to then figure out a way to convince the politicians of the day, Ted Heath being the Prime Minister, that this needs to sort of go ahead. But also it took the political will to affect that and to bring about that change.
And tell us a bit about the extent to which that made them sort of pushing in a slightly different direction to the Americans.
Sure. So during the 1960s, particularly in the early 1960s, there was another defector who defected to the CIA and who convinced the CIA that the KGB had created a deception program called the Master Plan. And apparently, according to him, this so-called master plan was to train Soviet officials in how to become defectors, but also its other purpose was to penetrate agencies and create sort of moles within. So taking that into account, MI5 started sort of jumping around, very paranoid about what was happening. And so MI5 was convinced, for a short period at least, that Graham Mitchell, the Deputy Director General, was a spy. It was convinced that Roger Hollis, the Director General, was a spy. It was forced to consider strongly that Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, was also a spy. Anyway, over a period of 10 years, they were able to discredit those claims from the CIA, claims that the CIA had inflicted on MI5. And so in early 1971, when Oleg Lialin presented himself, MI5 took a step that it hadn't taken during the Cold War, and that is to say, we're going to withhold information from our friends in the US. And they withheld the information, and they were able to sort of consider what this guy was presenting in a clear-headed way without having to defer to the US for advice and guidance, because they knew that if we go to the CIA is likely to guide us away from this, claiming, as they would later, that this guy had been sent by the KGB.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so if you sort of fast forward to today, and sort of this misalignment that we saw during the Cold War is sort of playing out today in the way that the Trump administration is acting, behaving, because it appears as though the administration is looking for a reset with Russia, whereas the UK and the rest of the Five Eyes allies, and more broadly, the NATO allies, are very much united in agreeing that Russia is the hostile state. Russia remains an adversary and adversarial. And so they try. So there is a complete misalignment on that front. And, the question is, to what extent will that affect the flow of intelligence? And
Sure.
I think it will, and I think it has to a degree. And that's because the intelligence on Russia is not as impartial as it once was. It's not as independent as it once was, and it's politically motivated.
Tell us about Oleg Lyalin himself, then. I mean, what was his story? How did he come to the UK? Why indeed did he stroll into a police station?
Well, he's a fascinating character in the sense that he came from a somewhat broken home, but he was recruited early on by the KGB during his teens. He was talent spotted for his English language skills, and he was trained to become initially an illegal. He was going to be sent to the US to be a sort of an illegal operative there. He didn't make the cut because I think partying got in the way, and he broke up with his first wife, and that became kind of his Achilles heel, because he would often gravitate towards fun stuff. And so when he made the Department V program, which is the department that specializes in sabotage and assassinations, that was a huge thing because it's quite a prestigious program to be a part of. And he was sent to the UK in 1969 as part of that program to plot against the UK and to recruit locally hired agents and to run them. But instead of doing that, instead of doing his job, he just fell in love with the London party scene during the late 1960s. And so he got diverted away from what he was supposed to do. And thankfully that was the case, because otherwise it could have been hugely damaging to Britain's emergency food supplies, to Britain's politics of the day and politicians.
So his defection then, was it simply because he'd fallen in love with his new life, or had he run into trouble?
Sure. So he had about four girlfriends that we know of. That's in addition to his wife. So his life became quite chaotic, and he thought that if he presented himself to MI5 and provided some secrets, MI5 would kick him out of the country at his own request. He said, if you kick me out of this country, the KGB, it would improve my status within the KGB. It will allow me to go back, divorce my wife, and be with my lover. So, of course, MI5 reacted the same way, and they said, well, let's just see how this goes. So through the verification process, they continued debriefing him, and they continued to find that the information he was providing was legitimate, and also it stood up to scrutiny. And so then the turning point came when he was driving drunk on Tottenham Court Road, and he was pulled over by the police for drink driving, and he refused to give his name, refused to be breath tested, and eventually he was bailed out by a Soviet official. And when they bailed him out, they realized he's no longer fit to be in this role. In fact, he hadn't been fit to be in this role for some time. So they recalled him. And when they recalled him, he decided to get in touch with MI5 and say, I want to defect, because up until then, he hadn't shown any signs of wanting to defect. But also one important thing is when he decided to defect, he rang up a woman, his English lover, to ask if she would defect with him. She said no. So he rang up the next woman. She said yes.
He had a checklist, I guess. Look, you mentioned Department V, Department 5, whichever the
Department V.
It was the KGB's sabotage and assassinations unit. It was axed after he sort of blew the whistle on its secrets. It was revived by Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, the program, the assassinations program, was revived. So it was, and that was a huge thing. Going back to your great question earlier about how this impacted our national security in a great way, because it forced the KGB to fall into this state of paranoia that the MI5 and the CIA has existed in throughout the 1960s, and it also forced them to close Department V. The program, the assassinations program to go after defectors, was not revived until Putin came to power, and his first known target in the West was Alexander Litvinenko. And of course, they tried to go after Skripal. They went after another guy called Anatoly Pateyev in Miami in 2020. And so that sort of carries on. So this idea that we're sort of misaligned with the US now is quite shocking, because the Kremlin's approach to the West has remained unchanged.
This is what I wanted to ask you. Is I mean, from this sort of fascinating story, which is, quite a long time ago in the 70s, how much lineage can we see between how the KGB acted then, figures like this, and how the KGB acts now?
Well, the KGB,
it's not the KGB
and
now,
the FSB, of course, and even before that, it was a Cheka or NKVD, whatever it is. They consider themselves Chekists. I mean, from their perspective, nothing's changed. The names change, but the behavior remains the same. And I think There was a pause for some time before Putin came in, but everything remains the same. There is no sign of change, despite all the sound bites that we're getting from the White House these days, or the headlines that sort of challenge conventional thinking about the Russian threat, rather. Everything remains the same. I mean, we remain a huge target and a priority target for the Kremlin, but somehow we're made to believe that they should no longer be the target. So the US, for instance, cut offensive cyber operations against the Kremlin early this year. It's insane. It's insane to even consider that. Whereas the Russians haven't done that. And then it brings into question the idea of receiving intelligence relating to Russia from the US. Well, how do you trust intelligence that isn't impartial? How do you trust it when it's not
absolutely.
independent? And it goes back to that.
Final question: when's it being made into a film?
Well, that's the intention. It's going out. So we're in the process of discussing things, and there's something happening with Five Eyes that I can't say too much about. But if you bring me back, I promise you, I'll talk to you all about it.
Well, it's a fascinating story. Richard Kerbaj, thank you so much indeed. The book is The Defector, and it is out now. The Defector, the untold story of the KGB agent who saved MI5 and changed the Cold War. Thank you very much indeed, Rich.